All right, so the question was, when do you use a specific hidden strike? When you have other options, other hidden strikes, how do you choose? Uh, so it's not a simple answer, but I created a flowchart here to walk kind of through it. But the answer depends on a couple things. Really, the answer is, what do you want your result to be? But there are a couple other factors that you have to consider before you get to that point. And just to make sure we are on the same page as far as terms, in this case, I have a glossary here with the file, and vor is before, you're acting first. Knock is after, you're reacting to someone else's action. Zufectin is out of measure. That's the range that requires more than a single step to hit your opponent's body. Post-Zufectin is after you cross that line, you're in measure, you can hit their body with a single step. There is this third distance here that is hinted at in the results, and that's ringen, which means grappling or wrestling distance. That distance then breaks down into two distances, which is grappling at the sword, meaning you can grab their sword and grapple with their sword, and then you can grab their body without moving, and that's grappling at the body. Uh, that's a little bit beyond the scope of this answer. However, that is a future consideration if you want to go into the weeds or down the rabbit hole of the details. I'm only mentioning it Ansetzen here. Ansetzen is a general term, but in this context, I'm using it to mean cut to long point. And then the last term that's important here is going to be springen, which means leaping laterally offline. So if you imagine you're standing and facing someone, you leap to your side, which usually means the right. There are some corrections that are made depending on the technique. For example, with a Zwerk against Vomtog, you would leap offline and in. That's a specific feature of Zwerk. You can use that footwork with other techniques, but I'm just generalizing here to make it more understandable. There is a lot of nuance. So, again, it's really the answer depends on things like vor and knock, the opponent's guard, your footwork choices, what distance you want to be at after the strike, and what type of advantage you want. I didn't say advantage in the bind because in some cases, again, outside the scope here, the advantage may not actually be a bind, but advantage is still a concept, having the center, etc. So when it comes to dealing with someone's incoming strike, you do have fewer choices, which is a good thing, but most of them are based on what action you want to take after your initial strike. The initial strike is called a Vorschlag, and your follow-up action is called a Nachschlag. There are two ways to approach this. The first is the easiest to learn and most common. This is called eyes closed. The idea is that you're going to launch a 1-2 combo regardless of what the other person's doing. This is easy to drill. You can basically practice combos in the air against a dummy, against a Pell, against a training partner, and this gets in your muscle memory and allows you to do it really fast. The second way is harder. It is the path of mastery, and it is something that requires feeling, to make a decision in the moment, in des, immediately within. These are part of Lichtenauer's 5 words. So using Fuelin and Indes to feel what your opponent is doing and make a split-second decision. And what you do for that second attack is going to be based on what the opponent is doing in reaction to your first attack. So that's why it's more complicated. That's the path of mastery. It's an important, critical part of Lichtenauer's tactical framework, but I wanted to present both options here because they matter. So going through this here, I have this broken down into where the rows, the row here, this is the dividing line. That tells us up here is vor, down here is knock. So I'm going to walk through the vor first. The vor meaning they haven't done anything yet. You're approaching them. If you approach them and you're out of measure and you want to attack first out of measure, the Lichtenauer tells us cut to long point and threaten the point with your sword. That's pretty straightforward. However, once you cross that line of being in measure and you're one step away from being able to hit them, you have choices. And those choices are first based on what they're doing. In this case, if they're not striking you, they're going to be in a position, right? A guard is a rigid thing. We reason about the four guards as where are their hands and where is their sword point. So Albar is any position where their hands are low and the point is not threatening you. In that case, you spring in, you leap offline, you Shido to their head. The result is you are now in a middle distance and you're in a high bind if they parried, or if they don't have that self-preservation instinct because of protective equipment, you're in a double. The next would be if they're an ox, usually on their left side, protecting their head from your Oberhau, assuming both fighters are righties. In this case, you spring in. You may need to move in. You may not need to move in. This is relative based on both of your sword lengths and your arm length. So it is a relative thing. So if they're an ox, you spring in, you crumpau, you end up in middle distance, and you end up in an overbind. What that means is that you still aim to hit them, not their sword. So, for example, if you're attacking ox, you might go for the hands or the forearm, but immediately after the situation, I would cover their blade with yours. You have an overbind, and you're likely in a position of advantage there. So, next, they're in a version of Vomtog, anything where their hands are higher and their point is away from you. You spring in, and then normally there's a hip rotation that moves you inward. With Zverkow, you usually end up in grappling distance, whether that's probably grappling at the sword. If they're also moving in once they see you move, it's probably grappling at the body. Regardless, as long as you've intercepted their sword, you're in a strong bind where parts of their sword are right on your crossguard because the crossguard now takes the center. Lastly, for the Vor, if they're in Flug, this can work against long point as well. I'm not including it on there because it's not really one of Lichtenauer's guards in the same way. But same idea as you step forward or you spring in to the left with your Shielha, and you end up generally in a middle distance. And because that you, sorry about that, because you're switching to the short edge, you end up in a strong bind or strong advantage. Okay, so that covers what to do if you're attacking first. If they're attacking you first, it changes things slightly. Should have turned off notifications. So you are now back in Zufechten, out of measure, and they're throwing an Oberhau at you, but they're out of distance, meaning it's probably not going to hit you if you stand still. So in this case, you see the incoming Oberhau, you Zornhau them, and then you immediately move in for the Zornhau Ort thrust. There's an entire, that everything from there is the entire Zornhau section. We're going to move on though. So if you cross that line between Zufechten and post-Zufechten, and then they throw an Oberhau or an Unterhau, then we have our options. So in this case, if it's an Oberhau or an Unterhau, and the end result is you want to stay in middle distance and have an overbind, you can spring in, you can crump, and then you end up in that middle distance and overbind. If it's only an Oberhau, you could, again, crump, but you can pick between Zverkow and Schielhau. Usually, you're going to pick the Zverkow if you're closer. You're going to pick the Schielhau if you're more in the middle distance. But again, you can manipulate your distance as needed. It's more so the end result that you want. So if you'd like to end up in grappling distance with a strong bind, you should Zverkow. If you'd like to end up in middle distance with a strong bind, you should Schielhau. The part that I can't really cover here is some of the nuance is based on what the opponent does. These are kind of like a flow chart if they're standing still for the most part. But for example, if you're reading your opponent and you think the most likely thing that's going to happen is that they also understand the best counter to a Zverkow is to counter Zverk, and you don't want to deal with that and get into a Zverk battle, in that case, I would probably choose Schielhau because I want that advantage. And it's allowing me to have better control of their sword. The crump can suppress their sword. However, in my experience, it's much harder to have the follow-up action that I would want to. So let me put it this way. If you want to get close and stay close, Zverkow in the knock, right? If you want to move to displace their attack, stay in middle distance, have some type of overbind, and then back up and figure something else out, Crumpal is probably the best choice. However, if you just want to take the most direct action that's either going to hit them or result in a thrust, and you want to be direct, Shiohao is your best option. So I know that's throwing a lot of information out there, but let me know if you have any questions. Thank you.